Welcome back to our channel. Let's dive in today's story.
I still remember the exact moment something inside me just stopped. Not broke, stopped. Like a machine that finally ran out of fuel after years of running on empty. It was a Thursday evening in late October, and I had spent the better part of 4 hours in our kitchen making a meal I'd been planning for 2 weeks. The apartment smelled like garlic and rosemary. The table had actual candles on it, and I even found the wine glasses we'd gotten as a wedding gift and never used. I wasn't trying to be romantic in some movie way. I just wanted one evening where my wife looked at me like I was worth the effort. Instead, what I got was the moment that ended our marriage. But let me back up, because this story doesn't really start that Thursday. It starts about 3 years earlier, when I was still convinced I was the problem. My name is Oliver. I'm 34 years old, I live in Chicago, and I work as a project manager for a mid-sized logistics company. I'm not flashy. I'm not the guy who walks into a room and makes everyone turn their heads. I'm the guy who remembers your coffee order, shows up on time, and stays late when the job needs it. I grew up in a house where my dad fixed things quietly and my mom kept the family together without ever asking for a medal, and I guess I absorbed that. For me, love was always something you did, not something you announced. A full tank of gas in her car before a long drive. Dinner on the table after a rough week. Remembering that she hated cilantro even though it went in literally everything. That's how I spoke. That's how I showed up. The problem is, and I know this now, that language only works if the other person is actually listening. Charlotte was 32, a brand strategist at a boutique agency downtown, and honestly one of the most magnetic people I'd ever met. When you first met her at a party, she owned the room. Funny, sharp, the kind of person who made you feel like you were the most interesting person alive when she talked to you. Her colleagues adored her. Her friends thought she was a legend. And when she turned that energy on me back when we were dating, I genuinely felt like I'd won something. The version of Charlotte I fell for remembered my stories, laughed at my terrible jokes, made me feel like the way I loved, quietly, through action, was enough. Then we got married, and somewhere in the years that followed, that version of her stopped showing up at home. At work, at dinners with friends, at her sister's birthday, she was still that person. But at home, with me, I became background noise. Something she tolerated. Something that was just there. We'd been together 6 years, married for 4 of them. We bought our condo together, split the down payment, and on paper it looked like a real partnership. I handled the maintenance, the bills, the grocery runs, the scheduling. She handled her career, which was demanding, and I respected that. I never asked her to do more than she could. What I didn't fully clock for a long time was that the imbalance wasn't just practical, it was emotional, and it was intentional. The jokes started small. A comment here and there when I'd cooked something elaborate. Only you would spend 3 hours making pasta from scratch on a Wednesday, Oliver said with a laugh, in front of her work friend who'd stopped by. And her friend laughed too, and I smiled because what else do you do? But it kept happening. At her coworker's birthday dinner, she told the whole table a story about how I'd reorganized our pantry by expiration date, and everyone laughed. And I sat there with a glass of wine pretending I was in on the joke. Around that same period, she'd also made a comment at home, just offhand, about a set of canvases I had propped against the wall in the second bedroom. I used to paint, nothing serious, just something I'd done since college, and she looked at them and said, "That's a lot of equipment for a hobby that doesn't really go anywhere." I laughed it off. I packed the canvases into the closet the following weekend and never took them back out. The thing is, those moments started to stack. I noticed that the stories she told about me were never flattering. They were always about me being too much, too careful, too domestic, too soft. She never told the story about how I drove 4 hours to pick her up when her car broke down in the middle of nowhere. She never mentioned that I took 2 days off work to help her move her mother between apartments. The Oliver in her stories was a punchline. The real one apparently didn't make for good material. So that Thursday in October, our fourth wedding anniversary, by the way, which she had forgotten, I cooked. Braised short ribs, roasted vegetables, the whole setup. I'd texted her that morning, just saying I had something planned for the evening. She texted back a thumbs up. I took that as enough. I should have known when I heard more than one set of footsteps on the stairs. She walked in with two coworkers, Diane and someone named Brett I'd met maybe once. They were mid-conversation about some client campaign, and Charlotte barely broke stride coming through the door. She glanced at the table, at the candles, at the whole thing I'd built, and I saw it. just a flicker of something on her face. And then she turned to her coworkers and said, "See, I told you he does this kind of thing." The way she said it, like I was an exhibit. Diane looked a little uncomfortable, honestly. Brett made a joke about me missing my calling as a private chef and laughed at his own joke. And Charlotte, she just smiled and started opening the wine I'd set out. I stood in my own kitchen, in my own home, on my own anniversary, and I felt like a stranger who'd wandered into someone else's party. I put food on the table. I sat down. I was quiet. I didn't make it weird, not because I wasn't hurt, but because I had already learned that making it weird meant I was too sensitive. So I ate. I made small talk. I smiled at the right moments. And the whole time something in my chest was going very, very still. After they left, I washed the wine glasses while Charlotte scrolled her phone on the couch. I asked her, calmly, if she remembered what today was. She looked up, paused, and said, "Oh, was that tonight?" And then she said what I think I'll hear in my head for the rest of my life. She said, "Oliver, you always make such a big production out of everything. It's a little much." Just like that. No apology. Not even discomfort. Just that. Like I was the problem for caring. I didn't say anything else. I finished cleaning the kitchen, turned off the lights over the stove, and sat at the table for a while with just the last candle still burning. On the counter was the little notebook I'd started keeping about 8 months earlier. I'd started it because my therapist had suggested journaling, and somewhere along the way it became something else entirely. It became evidence. Not because I was planning anything. At first I genuinely just needed proof for myself that I wasn't making things up. Because Charlotte had a way of responding to any complaint I raised with such calm certainty that I was overreacting that I started to actually believe her. The notebook said otherwise. 17 months of otherwise. I sat there with it in my hands and I read back some of the entries, and by the time I got to the entry from her coworker's birthday dinner, I already knew. I wasn't going to schedule a conversation. I wasn't going to ask her to try harder. I wasn't going to wait for her to suddenly realize what she had. I was going to make one phone call in the morning, and it was going to be to a family law attorney. And for the first time in a very long time, sitting at that table with a notebook full of things I should have said out loud, I felt completely clear. I woke up the next morning at 5:45, which was normal for me. What wasn't normal was that I didn't do a single thing I usually did. I didn't start the coffee maker on her setting. I didn't leave her overnight oats in the fridge with a note. I didn't check her calendar to see if she had an early meeting so I could remind her before she rushed out. I just made my own coffee, sat at the kitchen table in the quiet, and drank it alone. And the strange thing was, it didn't feel like punishment. It didn't feel like a Cold War. It felt like exhaling after holding my breath for years. I got dressed, packed my bag, and left before she was even awake. Just like that. Like a normal person living a normal life. Except nothing about what came next was going to be normal. Charlotte noticed by day 3. I came home to find her standing in the kitchen looking genuinely puzzled, like she'd walked into a room and couldn't remember why. She asked me if everything was okay. I told her I was fine. She waited for more, and I didn't give it. She said, "You've been really quiet." And I just nodded and went to my desk. I could feel her trying to figure out if I was sulking, waiting for her to apologize, running some kind of script she'd seen before. But I wasn't running any script. I was just done performing. What most people don't realize until they stop is how much they were actually doing. I went back through 6 months of bank statements that first week, and what I found was almost funny if it hadn't been so clarifying. I was covering 70% of our shared expenses. Not because we'd agreed on that split. We hadn't. It had just slowly become true without a single conversation. Groceries, utilities, the streaming subscriptions, the occasional dinner out, the random household things that just needed buying. I'd absorbed all of it so gradually that neither of us had ever stopped to name it. I printed those statements and put them in a folder. Then I added the notebook. Then I went through my phone and screenshotted every text exchange from the past year where I'd handled something. A plumber appointment, her dry cleaning, a reminder about her mom's doctor visit that she'd asked me to track. The folder got thick fast. I called my friend Derek on a Wednesday night, standing outside on our building's back stairwell because I didn't want Charlotte to hear. Derek had been my closest friend since college, and he was one of exactly 2 people who had ever looked me in the eye and said he thought Charlotte was not good for me. He didn't say "I told you so." He just listened, and when I finished he said, "Okay, do you want the name of the guy I used?" His cousin had gone through a divorce 2 years prior, and apparently the attorney was sharp, methodical, and didn't let emotion drive strategy. That was exactly what I needed. I wrote the name down. The consultation was on a Friday afternoon. I took a long lunch and told my office I had a dentist appointment. The attorney's name was Richard Hale, and he had the kind of office that felt deliberately calm. No clutter, no noise, just a man who'd clearly heard everything and reacted to nothing. I put my folder on his desk. He went through it quietly for about 10 minutes. Then he looked up and said, "You've been building this for a while." I told him it wasn't intentional at first. He said it didn't matter. What mattered was that I had a clear financial picture, documented patterns, and no criminal or dramatic incidents that could be weaponized against me. He told me what the process would look like, what I should and shouldn't do, and what to watch for in the coming weeks. I left that office feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time, like I was standing on solid ground. Meanwhile, at home, Charlotte's patience was running out. About 3 weeks after that Thursday, I came home to find the sink full of dishes and a kind of charged silence in the apartment. She was in the living room, and when I walked past, she said, "I've basically been handling everything myself lately." I stopped. I turned around. I looked at her and I asked her, very calmly, what exactly she'd been handling. She listed 3 things. 3. I had been managing our household in some form or another for 4 years, and she listed 3 things like they were a burden she'd been heroically bearing. I didn't argue. I just said, "Okay," and went to my room. But I wrote it down. Then her mother called. I didn't answer the first time, but she called again and I picked up because ignoring it felt like creating a different problem. Charlotte's mom, Linda, was not a bad person. She just believed that marriages were saved by the person willing to work harder. And in her head, that person was always the husband. She told me that Charlotte was stressed, that I was being distant, that marriage took effort from both sides. I listened. I said, "I appreciate you sharing that." And then I said I had to go. What I didn't say was that I was recording the call, not because I planned to use it, but because Richard had told me to document any third-party contact related to the marriage. I added it to the folder. The real break came on a Sunday night about 5 weeks in. I'd been in the second bedroom, which I'd quietly started using as my workspace, going through some paperwork when Charlotte appeared in the doorway. I don't know what set her off that particular evening, but she was done being measured about it. She told me I was acting like a child. She said I'd turned into someone she didn't recognize and that I was making her life harder on purpose. And then she said something that landed like a rock. She said, "You know what your problem is, Oliver? You think doing all these little domestic things makes you special. It doesn't. It just makes you needy." I looked at her for a moment. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw anything back at her. I just said, "Thank you for saying that out loud." She didn't know what to do with that, so she left. I closed the door, opened my laptop, and typed up what she'd said word for word with a timestamp. Then I sat back and thought about the fact that she had just, unprompted and completely voluntarily, told me exactly how she'd always seen me. 2 days later, I noticed something off in our joint account. A transfer of $1,800 to an account I didn't recognize, which Charlotte had made without mentioning it. I didn't confront her. I took a screenshot, forwarded it to my email, and sent it to Richard. He told me to keep monitoring and not to move any of my own funds yet, but to make sure I had access to records going back at least 2 years. I did. By that point, I had a folder, a spreadsheet, a chain of emails to my attorney, and the quiet certainty of someone who had already emotionally left the building and was just waiting for the paperwork to catch up. The night I printed out the final set of documents Richard had prepared, the petition, the financial disclosures, the asset summary, I sat at my desk for a long time. Charlotte was asleep down the hall. The apartment was quiet. I thought about the dinner, the candles, the wine glasses we'd gotten as a wedding gift. I thought about the notebook I'd started because I needed to prove to myself I wasn't crazy. And I thought about the version of Oliver who used to leave coffee on the counter for someone who never once said thank you. That guy had been gone for weeks. The one sitting at that desk with a neat stack of documents in front of him. He was ready. It was a regular Monday evening when I did it. No dramatic setup, no long build-up, no waiting for the perfect moment. Charlotte was in the kitchen pouring herself a glass of water, and I walked in, set the envelope on the counter, and said, "I need you to look at that." She picked it up with the kind of casual curiosity you'd have opening a piece of mail you weren't expecting. Then she saw what it was, and the glass stopped halfway to her mouth. She put it down very carefully, like she was buying herself a second to think, and then she looked at me and said, "Are you serious right now?" I told her I was. She laughed, not a real laugh, more like a reflex, and said this was insane, that I was blowing up our entire marriage over a dinner. I told her it wasn't about the dinner. I told her it was about 6 years of a pattern that I had documented in detail and was fully prepared to present. The laugh stopped. The 2 weeks that followed were the most unpleasant stretch of the whole process, and I say that having lived through the marriage itself. Charlotte found an attorney named Susan Park, who by all accounts was aggressive and strategic, and within the first week the tone shifted completely. Suddenly I was being framed, through various channels, as emotionally withdrawn, financially controlling, and, my personal favorite, someone who had been building a case against his wife out of pettiness and wounded pride. Her attorney sent a letter suggesting that my financial documentation was an attempt to intimidate. Richard read it, set it down, and told me it was a standard opening move and that the documentation was exactly what we needed. I trusted him and stayed quiet. The mediation session was held in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building downtown, 6 weeks after I'd handed Charlotte that envelope. Neutral space, 2 attorneys, a mediator, and the two of us sitting on opposite sides of a table for the first time in what felt like our entire marriage. Charlotte came in looking composed and professional, which I expected. What she didn't expect was the binder Richard placed on the table. 43 pages. Bank records going back 2 years. A breakdown of household expense contributions. Screenshots of text exchanges where I'd managed appointments, handled logistics, covered costs. The notebook entries, not all of them, just the ones that showed a clear and repeated pattern. And the financial transfer. The $1,800. Her attorney had clearly not been told about that one because there was a pause in the room that was very different from the other pauses. The mediator asked Charlotte's attorney to respond to the transfer documentation, and the response was careful in a way that told me everything. Charlotte sat across from me, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked like she didn't have the next line ready. What came out in the weeks following mediation hit differently than I expected. A woman named Gail, someone who had been in Charlotte's friend group for years and apparently had a falling out with her around the time of the filing, reached out to me directly through a mutual contact. She didn't want anything. She just said she thought I should know some things. She forwarded me a handful of messages from a group chat where Charlotte had been talking about the marriage for well over a year. In those messages, Charlotte described our relationship as something she had outgrown and referred to me, specifically, as someone who was sweet but small. She hadn't been blindsided by my filing. She'd been waiting to see who would blink first. And she had assumed, apparently with complete confidence, that it would be me. That detail didn't make me angry. It made everything make sense in a way that was almost a relief. About 3 weeks after mediation, Charlotte came to the condo to collect the last of her things. We'd agreed on a time, I was there, and it was nothing like the dramatic final confrontations you see in movies. She moved through the apartment quietly with 2 large bags and a rolling suitcase. I sat in the kitchen and drank coffee. At one point, she stopped in the hallway and looked at me for a moment. Really looked, the way she almost never did, and said, "I didn't think you'd actually go through with it." I didn't say anything for a second. Then I said, "I know." She nodded once, picked up her bags, and left. The door closed. I finished my coffee. The divorce was finalized 4 months after I'd handed her that envelope. The settlement reflected what the documents had shown. My financial contributions were significant and consistent. Hers had decreased substantially in the second half of our marriage, while her personal spending had increased. I kept the condo. We split the joint account evenly, which was actually a better outcome than Richard had initially projected given the undisclosed transfer. Charlotte walked away with less than she'd entered mediation expecting, and I walked away with something that couldn't go in any binder. The feeling of having told the truth about my own life and been believed. The first month alone in the condo was strange. Not painful, strange. The place felt bigger. I cooked what I wanted, when I wanted, without calculating whether it was too elaborate or too domestic or too much. I pulled the canvases out of the closet where they'd been sitting for 3 years and set them up in the second bedroom. I started painting again slowly, the way you pick up something you'd forgotten you were good at. I set up a proper workspace, and I actually used it. Friends came over more. My sister, who had quietly disliked Charlotte for years without ever saying so directly, started calling me every Sunday. The rhythm of my own life came back to me slowly, and then all at once, the way those things do. About 8 months after the divorce, I met someone through a mutual friend at a small dinner. Her name was Nora. She was a landscape architect, and on our third time getting coffee, she asked me what I'd made for dinner the night before because I'd mentioned I'd been cooking more. I told her and she said, "That sounds really good. Will you make it sometime?" Just like that. No punchline. No performance. Just a normal person showing genuine interest in another normal person. I didn't fall dramatically in love on the spot or anything like that. I just noticed the difference, quietly, the way you notice the temperature change when you finally step out of a building you've been inside too long. I heard about Charlotte about a year later, through Derek, who heard it from someone in her professional circle. The agency she worked for had gone through a restructuring and her position had been eliminated. She'd moved to a smaller apartment across town, and from what Derek understood, she was freelancing, which in her industry was a significant step back from where she'd been. I didn't feel triumphant when I heard that. I genuinely didn't. What I felt was a kind of neutral distance, like hearing news about a city you used to live in. Something had happened there. It didn't really touch me anymore. If I'm being honest with you, the thing that took the longest to unlearn wasn't the anger. There wasn't much anger, not really. It was the habit of minimizing myself, of automatically framing my own efforts as excessive, my own feelings as dramatic, my own presence as something that needed to be apologized for. Charlotte didn't install that in me overnight. I let it accumulate, adjustment by adjustment, until I couldn't see the shape of it anymore. The notebook didn't just document her behavior. It documented how small I had allowed myself to become. And I think that's the thing worth sitting with, whether you're in a situation like mine or not. Not, was my partner bad? But, when did I stop taking my own experience seriously? And why did that feel like the easier choice? I don't have a clean answer to that. But I know what the other option looks like now. And I'm not going back.
Oliver, honestly, it's so good to see you painting again and being your true self. My advice is simple. Never let anyone make you feel too much for just being a caring person. You deserve to be with someone who actually says thank you for the coffee, so keep trusting that quiet strength of yours.